Well,
Trash.
Supperman.
Okay. Welcome to Grace Fellowship Church of Paulding County on our Halloween celebration. And I am your machine gun preacher. And we'll be in Hebrews chapter 8 today, so you better pay attention, especially since I've got Moses here next to me. Say a few words, Moses.
Don't show be having any of those golden calves where these are going on the ground. And they're throwing
Moses, the
down.
early years.
Yes, Moses, the early years, and with glasses. It's
Yeah, my eyesight's pretty poor looking at that fire by day.
Come on in the picture.
She's walking around.
Oh, she's got to get the older one. She's got to get the older one. Come on up here. Our camera lady, who's been doing such a good job doing our videoing. Yay!
Back behind the camera I go.
Happy Halloween, everybody.
Happy Halloween.
Believe it or not, we are now. Oh, I forgot to do it that way. Believe it or not, we are actually starting chapter 8 of Hebrews. We're just moving right along now. Chapter 8 is when we're going to be introduced in more detail to the new covenant. We're not going to really be talking about that today because the first few verses don't talk about it. We get into it kind of in the middle of the chapter, but really it's what we're leading up to is the new covenant. So that's kind of the theme of chapter 8. So, what we're going to be talking about today as we begin chapter 8, the first 5 verses, what's the point? Isn't that what we always want to know? What's the point? Well, that's what the author of Hebrews actually answers for us in the beginning of chapter 8. In the first 2 verses of the chapter, we're going to be continuing on in our discussion of Christ as our high priest and his work. He begins with the phrase, the point of what we are saying is this. So that's what's the point. What he, in these first few verses of chapter 8, he's going to be kind of circling around again and summarizing some of what he's been talking about before, all through chapter 7, talking about Christ as our great high priest. And he's going to re-summarize some of what that means. It's actually, as I'm sure Kim and Jamie would agree, a standard teaching technique. You introduce an idea and then you develop it through your point 1, 2, 3, 4. And at the end, you come back and you re-emphasize that point to show how what you developed in detail supports that initial point. And that's kind of what he's saying here, and saying the point of what we're saying is this. All of what he's talked about in chapter 7, there's a reason for it. That word there that is translated point, it means the main or principal thing. The root of that word is actually the word head. The idea of head being the main thing on a person's body. So what the author has been developing concerning this high priest has had a point. In other words, what he's saying is that it's not just some random theological discussion. He didn't bring up all these points we talked about in chapter 7 about the high priest and how he was appointed and how the high priest came to be and what their work was and what their service was and all of that. All of that wasn't just a random theological exercise or a random historical exercise. He had a point. He's leading up to something. So the point of what we're saying is this. And he says, we do have such a high priest. Now that phrase, such a high priest, you probably remember that because it was from the previous chapter. It refers back to chapter 7, verse 26, where the author reveals that we have such a high priest. That phrase, such a high priest, meaning the kind or sort of high priest, that meets the need from back in chapter 7, verse 11. Now, if you remember that, I've talked about it a few times, but he keeps referring back to it. Chapter 7, verse 11 was, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, then why was there still a need? Well, like the great high priest Christ met that need. He was able to meet that need. We have that kind of high priest who could meet that need that the Levitical priesthood could not meet. So we have this high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne. Now, talking about this phrase that he sat down at the right hand of the throne, there are theologians, there are commentators who use a phrase like this, where he sat down, to bring the idea or develop the idea that he sat down because Christ completed his work. In fact, I've heard that preached before. Now, while that is certainly true, that Christ's work was completed, it's part of what he's been saying off and on in the past, and he will say more in the future, that what Christ did, his work, was once for all, that it was a completed work. While that is certainly true, that's not really the point of this particular verse, this particular phrase. When he said that he sat down at the right hand, this particular word, seated at the right hand, has to do with not the fact that you sit down because you're not doing anything anymore, because you're idle. It's the idea of being seated in a place of authority. That phrase, being sitting down at the right hand of the throne, is referring not to him being idle, but it is referring to his place of divine authority. It's the same idea as like a judge comes into a courtroom and sits down behind his bench. Just because he's sitting down, that doesn't mean he's not doing anything. In fact, that's when things really get going, when the judge sits down behind the bench. So this being seated has to do with the idea of his authority. And mentioning that he is seated at the right hand is sort of an Oriental first century kind of expression that refers to a place of preeminence or power authority, being at the right hand of the king, so to speak. You probably heard that phrase before. It's almost like we say somebody is our right-hand man. It has to do with the idea of a place of prominence. So he is seated at the right hand of the majestic heavenly throne. And so he uses this phrase to refer to that place of prominence in heaven, which is the abode of God. That word that is translated majestic, megalosune, you see in that Greek word the word megas, and we've talked about that word before, that it means great. This particular word, it means greatness. It's used mostly in the New Testament to refer to God himself. It's kind of where we get the idea, where we get the phrase when you're talking to a king, you say your highness, and it's a reference to their high position over you because they're a king. It's kind of the same idea with this word majestic, a place of majesty. The point here being that place of power and authority. That's what's the central idea behind Christ sitting down at the right hand of the throne. And in addition to that, and I think this reemphasizes the fact that when he says he was seated, it doesn't mean he's idle. It says he serves in the sanctuary. He sat down at the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle, set up by the Lord and not by man. So this is the evidence, as I said, that his seating is about his authority, his place, and not about what you might call idleness. The word there, serve, the Greek is liturgos. It's a compound word. The first part of it, laos, means people. The second part, ergon, means work. So it is a public servant. The idea of working for the people. It's where we get our English word liturgy from. When we think of the word liturgy or liturgical, normally we think of work that a cleric does, clerical work. And of course that's the kind of the way it became to be used in many churches. But it really has just a generic meaning of a public servant, like anyone who serves the public. like even, someone in government might be a public servant. It's the idea that what they do is on the behalf of the people. So thinking about him as our high priest and we are his people, then what he is doing is therefore working on our behalf. And, excuse me, and I think this is significant because when we think about what Christ is as our advocate, and it's a lot of times because when we focus on his redemptive work, we tend to think of it rightly, theologically, as something he did one time for all. It's something that was completed and finished. But there's still that aspect of Jesus' relationship with us where it is continuous throughout our lives, where he continues to be our advocate. He continues to work in our lives. As Paul said in Romans 8, that God works all things for good to those that love him and are called according to his purpose. And so there's this sense that God continues to work in our lives, to arrange things in our lives, to provide for us in a way that we can meet the call that he has onto our life. And so this picture then of our great high priest doing this one-time work of redemption, but yet even after that, he hasn't left us alone. He doesn't he doesn't come in and do the redemptive work and then abandons us for the rest of our lives. It's a continual relationship. He continues to work in our lives on our behalf. And that's the idea of this word here, public servant or servant of the people, working on our behalf. Jesus continues to work on our behalf. He's already taken care of the work of redemption, but we have other work in our lives as we grow in our lives, as we grow spiritually, as we learn about what he has called us to do and how he wants us to grow and what he wants us to do and how he is going to direct us and guide us and lead us and how he's going to enable us to accomplish the things that he calls us to do. And as I've talked about before in other contexts, how God never promises that there won't be storms in our life, but he does promise that we will not be alone in the storms. He will be there in the boat, literally with us in the storms. And so there's so many areas and aspects that you can look at the work of this great high priest in our life that is continual, that is a form of his working on our behalf. Whether it's guidance, whether it's leadership, whether it's providing things, whether it's being there, comforting us in the storms, whether it's even working in a miraculous way or just an ordinary way, through just sending somebody our way to help us, or maybe that we need to help. You could think about 1,000 ways. The point is he continues to be active. He continues to work on our behalf. It's kind of strange to think about him being our servant. But Jesus is represented to us not only as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, but also the servant of man, the great suffering servant, who is there to provide what we need to make us what God wants us to be. So he continues to serve us. And he serves, it says, in the sanctuary. That word means a sacred thing or a sacred place. So the idea is that he's serving God's people in the place where they cannot go. And I think this is and we're going to get to this a little bit more in a minute, but when we start talking about the parallels between the sanctuary and later the temple, and from the metaphorical standpoint, what they represent as far as our relationship with God. And this idea that when thinking about the human high priest again, when the great high priest on the Day of Atonement, when he goes to the Holy of Holies to sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice, on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, he is going in a place where the people cannot go. He is serving in a way that the people cannot serve. And therefore he represents the great high priest, Christ, who serves us in a place we cannot go. We cannot go into God's holy place on our own. We can't do that. He serves us in the way and in the place we cannot go ourselves because He can. So He serves in the sanctuary, in the true tabernacle. This is an interesting phrase, and he'll refer to it to this same idea again in a couple more verses. And this implies that the earthly tabernacle is not the real tabernacle. And again, just for historical reference, when he's talking about the tabernacle, he's talking about that temporary structure, basically a tent. That's what the word tabernacle means, is a tent. And it was what God had commanded Moses to order the people to construct. And as they traveled through the wilderness, whenever they would make an encampment, they would put this tent up, and it would be kind of in the center of the camp with everybody else camped around it. And the glory of God would hover over it, and it would represent the place where God would meet them. And then when they would move somewhere, they would take it down and move it with them. So the whole idea was temporary. And later on, the temple itself, the permanent structure that Solomon built, would be built sort of along the same lines of construction as the tabernacle was, just in a permanent way. But the point is what he is suggesting here is that tabernacle was only representing something. It wasn't the real tabernacle. That Christ, as our great high priest, serves in a heavenly tabernacle. And he says it was set up by the Lord and not by man. And again, that tabernacle that is mentioned in the law, the Hebrews built at Moses' direction, it was apparently not sufficient. It was not the true place of real atonement. The true tabernacle was made not by men, but by God. So, in verse 3, we see the high priest has work to do. Verse 3, he says, every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. So, first of all, he talks about this idea of the high priest being appointed. Now, we talked about this in the last chapter, how the author had already given us a contrast in the differences between the ways of appointing of the earthly Levitical priests versus Jesus after the order of Melchizedek. That the Levitical priests achieved their office by direction of the law, based only on their human genealogy, what tribe they were from, who their father was. But this contrasted with how Christ was appointed, not by law, but by the oath of God. But in both cases, this appointment was for a purpose. And he said to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Now, what's the difference between those two, gifts and sacrifices? The first word, gift, it just means literally a present, something that you give to someone. It's the same Greek word that was used to describe the gifts that the Magi gave to the infant Jesus in Matthew 2:11. It's the idea of gifts of thanksgiving or praise or celebration of some kind. It's essentially a form of worship. However, sacrifices, the Greek word thusia, means literally to sacrifice something by slaying it, usually by fire, implying that there is a victim of that sacrifice. This particular word always is used to describe a sacrifice for the atonement of sin. So these are the two different purposes that the high priest had. And if you remember from the law, there were certain sacrifices that they made. There were certain praise sacrifices and gifts and things like that were not atonement. They were just offerings of praise and worshipfulness and thankfulness to God. Whereas, the Day of Atonement was for the atonement of sin. So he says, he's talking about how the Levitical priests offered these gifts and sacrifices. So since they had sacrifices to give, it was also necessary for this one also to have something to offer. This one here being Christ as the great high priest. So he's going to be a little more explicit about this in the next chapters. This is more of an introduction to the idea. But this is a preview to the truth that he offered himself his own blood. So he had a sacrifice to offer, but it's a different one. So in the verses 4 and 5, we ask the question what the human priest's work represented. He says, if he were on earth, talking about Christ, he would not be a priest, for there are already men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. So, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest. This is an interesting phrase here, an interesting idea to think about when we think about Christ. He's contrasting, it's interesting, ever since the beginning of Hebrews, it's been a study of contrasts and comparisons, hasn't it? Here he's contrasting the place, if you will, and I use that term loosely because when you're talking about a spiritual realm like heaven, the word place kind of almost is irrelevant, but just for the sake of conversation, we'll call it that. He's contrasting the place where Christ does his priestly work with the place where the Levitical priests did their priestly work. They did their work, of course, here on earth. Whereas, as we know from that previous verse we just talked about, Christ did his at the majestic heavenly throne, in the very presence of God in heaven. So if he were on earth, it says he would not be a priest. And so I think that's an interesting thing when we talk about his place in the plan of redemption. We talk about him being, for example, the prophet and priest and king. Well, it says here that when he was on earth, he was not actually doing priestly work. Because here on earth, when he was here, he was the sacrifice, not the priest. Here on earth, he was the lamb. It was being led to the slaughter, shedding its blood. So when he was on earth, he was not the priest. It was when he ascended into heaven that he did the priestly work. He says there are already men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. So what he's essentially saying, we don't need any more priests under the law. We got enough priests now. We don't need any more. The law's given us all the priests we need. But what Christ did as high priest was superior to anything the Levites could do. So we don't need any more priests. Now that the great high priest has come after the order of Melchizedek, whose work is actually completed, who is actually able to meet the need that the Levitical priest could not, we don't need any more priests. So he says they, and this is the Levitical priest, serve in a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow. And remember back in verse 2, he was talking about how the tabernacle in heaven was a true tabernacle. So this means that what we had on earth, the tabernacle, was only a representative of something else and not the real thing. He says it's a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. So this always brings up the interesting question. And I've had people ask me this before. Does that mean he is suggesting that in heaven there is a tabernacle that the one here on earth was just a copy of? It's, in fact, the very first time I ever taught through the book of Hebrews in a Sunday school class, I had one of the men in the Sunday school class came to me and asked me that very question. And it's the first time anybody ever asked me, I'd kind of just, this is a verse I'd read and kind of said, yeah, and just kind of passed over it and not really thought about it. And I studied a little bit more about this because there's theologians who are a lot smarter than me and who do a lot of cultural study and everything have pointed out that around this time, the first century. And one of the other philosophical disciplines outside Christianity that was very popular was called Greek dualism. Obviously, it was part of the Greek philosophy, and it was this notion that things on earth were a copy of something that was in a different spiritual realm, like there was a dual property to some things. And that's one of the things, and this is not all of it, but it's kind of where they get the idea of, in their pantheon of gods, there was a god of war and a god of love and a god of this and a god of that. It was kind of this dual nature of some concept here on earth that there would be a god of that. And there were other aspects of this Greek dualism too. And some suggest that the author of Hebrews was influenced by that in trying to suggest some kind of a spiritual dualism here between the tabernacle on earth and the tabernacle in heaven. I personally reject that idea. To me, that does not make any sense. I think when we do something like that, we're overanalyzing it. I think really what his point here is not to try to suggest that in some kind of metaphysical way there is up in heaven an actual tabernacle like the one that was here on earth. That doesn't even in a way make sense, because heaven is a spiritual place. It's not a physical place in the sense that we think of a place. So it wouldn't even really make sense. His whole point through all of Hebrews, when he's talked about things that represent something else in the metaphorical sense, I think what his point here is merely to say that what the tabernacle was to the Hebrews during those Exodus times was it represented the presence of God among the people. And it represented how we approach God and how God deals with sin through the great high priesthood. So in the sense, it represents then the real abode of God, which is heaven. And the real presence of God, which is through our relationship with Christ. And the way that in reality he deals with sin through the work of Jesus Christ. And so this is where I've mentioned this before. Sometimes, and I'm as guilty of this as any because I'm a very sort of analytical person, and I have a tendency to try to overanalyze things. And sometimes you can overanalyze things, and I've talked about this before when it comes to like you're trying to interpret a parable especially. And sometimes we'll read a parable that Jesus told, and we'll try to say every little detail in that parable means this or means that or represents. And most of the time it's just, it's just the point of the story that we're supposed to get. We don't try to have to analyze every little character represents this or every little action represents this. It's just, there's usually just a spiritual point to the story, and we don't need to read anything more to it than that. And so when you're talking about things like this that are essentially metaphorical, and that is to say, he's saying that physical earthly sanctuary represents the presence of God among his people, we don't really need to analyze it any farther than that. When he says the true tabernacle, in heaven, he's talking about that heaven is the real abode of God. Heaven doesn't live in a tent. God doesn't really live in a tent that we build. We can't put God in a little tent that we build. His real abode is heaven. And I think that's the point, that the tabernacle was just a copy and a shadow in the sense that it represented the greater presence of God and the abode of God. And that's where the priestly work of Christ happens, in the presence of God, at the throne of God. So I don't think we need to overanalyze this and try to suggest that in heaven there's a big tent, just like it's described in the Old Testament. I don't think that's what he's saying at all. There's no Greek dualism in the Scripture. I think it's just simply that it represents the presence of God and the throne of God and the place where Christ did his priestly work. And so he says this is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. So why did he make a big deal about that? Well, because the temple, or the tabernacle and later the temple, represented the sacred abode of God, it needed to be the best that they could do. It needed to represent that they followed the instructions to the T, because it was a serious, sacred, holy thing. You're not just going to go to the thrift store and buy something to put up and say that's the tabernacle. No, you have to do it a certain way. Not because it had to match what's up in heaven, but because it represented the presence of God. So therefore, you have to pay attention to what I tell you that the nature of God is. In a way, it's teaching them to take seriously what they are taught about the nature and character of God. It's not what we want to make of it, it's what He tells us it is. It's not our wisdom, it's not what necessarily we would do, it's what God tells us to do. It's His wisdom, not man's wisdom. You know, to them, when they were reading the directions, I don't know how long it's been since you've read, you know, since you've read about the specific directions of the construction of the tabernacle. But it really, really is detailed. I mean, down to how big the little rings are that the curtains were going to be on, and how thick everything was supposed to be, and how, you know, what everything was supposed to be made of. I mean, it's really detailed, you know. And they were probably thinking as they're reading all this, seriously? Why does it matter, you know? It's just a tent, you know? But what his point was is, no, it's not just a tent. This is where you meet God. So it may not make sense to you in your man's wisdom, but you follow my direction, and then I will meet with you there. And that's why it was important that he follow the directions. Because we had to see things the way God saw things. We had to measure things the way God measures things. We had to place importance on things that God thought were important. Can you imagine what the tabernacle would have looked like if God just said, build the tabernacle? However you want, just do it your way. Does it scare you to think about? They would have
agreed on anything.
Well, they would have first formed a committee, right?
Yeah.
We're going to have the tabernacle committee.
And then it would have split over the color of the carpet.
Yes, they would have. They would
Many
have.
windows to put up.
That's right.
Thinking burgundy for the sacrificial chamber.
Exactly. I don't want it made of brass, because then we have to polish it so much. Let's make it out of, I don't know, let's make it out of silver. I mean, this is God, you know, we need to make that of silver, not brass. Yeah, we would have had all kind of arguments and committees and a subcommittee, and we would have had to have had a tabernacle building fund, you know, and then in about 10 years we might have had something up.
Blueprint.
And then it would have probably fallen down. But God said, no. You do it this way. Whether it makes sense to you or not, you do it this way. Just do it. Because it represents my presence among you.
No.
I guess that's the end of the sermon.
You took too long without touching it.
Well,
Maybe.
that's a big
You're
surprise.
gonna have to
isn't
sign me, have to sign back in.
Even the building itself, when they built the temple, was designed.
it? Well, I was almost through anyway.
Well, he did that with the ark too.
Yes, he did.
Imagine
Yes,
if
he
Noah
did.
hadn't done everything God said.
I was just
said
thinking
not
that over there, I was
use
gonna
it.
say
You're
that when
right.
he stopped talking. Yeah, the same thing with the ark.
They had to put it together like a puzzle, because they had to build everything and shape it outside,
Mm-hmm.
and because there was no tools to be used inside the temple.
Yeah.
So they had to fit everything in like a puzzle. Put everything.
Tetris.
Yeah, Tetris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, imagine if we had designed that. What kind of a mess we would have made of it. You know.
You didn't have room for the giraffes to have their neck out.
And again, I think that's the point of God's detailed instructions. Follow my wisdom, not your wisdom. Do it my way, not your way. You don't have to worry if it makes sense or not. You just need to do it my way. So that's where we're actually going to leave it today. over the next few weeks, it's going to be really interesting because as we begin to talk about the new covenant, which is going to be either next week or the week after, depending on how long the next couple of verses are. But, or how long I take on the next couple of verses. So it'll either be next week or the week after. When we talk about the new covenant, we're actually going to probably not just talk about the new covenant, because from a theological and historical standpoint, just talking about the new covenant out of context will probably not be as beneficial to our understanding until we look at the other covenants. Now, we've mentioned them before. We have talked about them very briefly. But I intend to have a detailed lesson about all of the covenants, where they came from, where they are, how they relate to this covenant. Because when you say we're going to talk about the new covenant, you need to know about what the old covenant was and how it's different from the new covenant and why there is a new covenant. And the author of Hebrews has been building up toward this since the previous chapter, because remember he said that because Christ was the order of a new order of priesthood, Melchizedek priesthood, which did not come from the law, that means there must be a new law, because there's a new order. So that leads to the new covenant. In fact, part of the new covenant is talking about the new law, a new law written in our hearts instead of on parchment. That's actually part of the new covenant. So it's what he's been building up to. You know, the author of Hebrews has just worked this way, just continues to build one brick upon another, and everything leads to the next thing. And so he's building this case. And that's what he's, through the priesthood, has been building up toward the new covenant. So we'll probably spend a whole Sunday just on the covenants. But I think it's important. I think it'll help in understanding the reason and significance of the new covenant.
Covenant Sunday.
Covenant Sunday, that's right. So that's all I got for today.